Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I'll continue to let some other folks in from the waiting room that are arriving right now. Before I turn it over to our speaker to get started, I do just want to remind you all of our usual housekeeping items that we cover. If you could keep your microphone muted throughout the session to avoid disruptions, we'd really appreciate that. We do encourage you to continue to have conversations throughout the presentation in the chat and drop any questions for Ms. Zika in there as well. So please do drop those questions in the chat. Also at the end, you can raise your hand and we'll call on you to unmute yourself and ask your question aloud too. My last little housekeeping note is to remind you that the session is being recorded, and we will add this to our YouTube Public Service Perspectives YouTube channel. And before we get started, if anyone has any announcements or upcoming events they'd like to share with the group, I welcome you to go ahead and do that at this time. Natalie, do you know, I know Jen had sent me something and it's lost deep in my inbox, but it is a water initiative. It should be relevant to folks that are interested in this session. Do you have any knowledge of what that was? I can try to dig it up.
Jen's on here, I'm not sure.
Oh, Jen's on here, perfect. Jen, do you want to go ahead and share about, I think it was called Ohio River Basin. There's a webinar.
Mackenzie, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. I'm driving on my heading towards Wetlands. I'm not sure how well my reception will continue. I'm trying to remember what that was. There was the Ohio River Basin Alliance Summit, but that was in October and that's passed. So I can't think of what the most.
Just found it. Sorry, I thought I had it prepared and handy beforehand.
Yes, the recreation. Yes,
yep.
If you could read that, that would be great. Thanks.
I will, of course. Thanks so much. Sorry, thought I had it ready and I lost it, but I have it now. I'm going to drop it in the chat as well for you all. I'll link to it. But Jen is involved in the Ohio River discussion series. They have the Ohio River Recreation. There is a registration for their conversation that they're going to have on Tuesday, November 16th. So this coming Tuesday at noon. If you all are interested in joining, I'll go ahead and drop the link for that in the chat. Any other announcements? Okay, well, I will move on forward and I'm going to turn the mic over to Dr. Natalie Kreutz. She will be introducing our speaker, Ms. Zika Sullivan.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm really happy to introduce Dr. Majika Sullivan from the School of Environment and Natural Resources at Ohio State. He is a professor there, Associate Director and Chief Diversity Office for the School of Environment and Natural Resources at Ohio State, and also directs the Scheermeyer-Olentangy River Wetland Research Park. I was lucky enough to meet Majika and work with him through some work supporting the protection of ephemeral waterways in Ohio with the Ohio Attorney General's office. And so I'm really excited that we have him here to speak today about this intersection between policy and science and advocacy and the role of scientists in advocating for environmental protection. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Majika, and thank you very much.
Great, thanks for the intro and hello everybody. It's great to be here. So yeah, I think Natalie set this up really, Dr. Kreutz set this up really nicely. I'm going to be talking to you all today about that I think very important intersection in the work that I've done in this space, particularly around waters of the US or the waters that are protected under the Clean Water Act. And so there's sort of 5 parts I want to talk about in this presentation. And the first one is actually to talk about the science behind the connectivity of waters and how over time, particularly recently, the federal waters, and those are the WOTUS waters of the US, have been restricted, those that are protected. And I want to talk a little bit about how the current rule is inconsistent with science, and then some of the impacts, and then conclude by talking about sort of my experiences in policy and advocacy around this particular issue. Although I think the broader conversations around advocacy and science, I think this provides a nice example of that. And just some thoughts about what role scientists can and perhaps should play. That's where I want to go today. Feel free to drop questions in if you have them as I go. And then there'll be a time at the end, I think, for us to chat a little bit more. But before we do that, there's a lot of acronyms in this space, as any other space, and I want to make sure that we just mention these briefly. So the Clean Water Act was enacted in 1972. I think most of you are probably familiar with it, but it really is the key regulatory the piece of legislation around federal protection of water. Waters of the U.S., and this is where it can be a little confusing, WOTUS, is actually the rule that is the backbone of the Clean Water Act. It's the rule that guides which particular waters are actually protected federally. So for example, streams versus wetlands versus lakes versus rivers, those sorts of things, right? So the Clean Water Act says, yeah, we have to protect the biological and physical and chemical integrity of our waters. Then the Clean Water Rule says which waters that actually applies to. And it applies to all, to US states as well as territories. And so the Clean Water Rule was a rule that, so to be clear, that the WOTUS, the waters of the US, that can be changed. Those waters can be changed. Which of those are protected can be changed under different administrations. And so the most recent two here, the Clean Water Rule, and that was a redefining of waters of the US under Obama. And then the most recent is the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. And that was the redefinition under the Trump administration. And as an example, from the Clean Water Rule to the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, which is what we are under now, we've lost millions and millions of acres of wetlands and millions of miles of streams, the protection for those. And I'll talk about this again, so you'll have some repetition here to get these concepts clear for if you're unfamiliar with these. And then the last one is the Science Advisory Board, the SAB, and that'll come up, but that's a federal EPA board made up of experts from around the country who reviewed and informed the Clean Water Rule, and it actually did not support the Navigable Waters Protection Rules through their statements against that. I want to use that as a backdrop. I also want to just mention there's going to be 3 types of streams that we're going to be talking about, but these can, to some degree, be applied to wetlands as well. But ephemeral are streams that flow only after a precipitation event, so it rains or it snows and melts really, and then that's the stream will flow. But the rest of the time, it'll be dry. Intermittent would be those that flow seasonally, so perhaps flow in the spring and the fall, but dry out in the summer. And the perennial are those that flow year round. And this is really important. That distinction is very important because when we talk about which waters are protected and which waters are not protected, these are categories that align with protections and versus loss of protections. So to get us started, as I said, I'm going to spend a little time talking about the science. And again, just to back up, what I'm really doing here today is using waters of the US, the Clean Water Act, and water protection in general as an example where I think science is critical, science, advocacy, policy, all those, there's a really interesting and I think critical intersection. But in order to really understand that, I think we need to kind of backstep and talk about what's going on here. And so I want to start by talking about the science of the connectivity of waters. And partly because it's not just a scientific concept, but it's actually been a flashpoint for legislation and policy as well. So what you're looking at here is a conceptual figure of a watershed. Sometimes people call it a catchment or a drainage network, right? So you've probably heard those terms. And this particular image is taken from the 2015 connectivity report, in which technical experts reviewed over 1,200 peer-reviewed scientific publications. So the larger river, the one you're seeing here, would be considered a traditional navigable water, and in other words, it's jurisdictional and it's protected, right? Sometimes we call those downstream waters, but traditionally, these navigable waters have always been protected under the Clean Water Act. So, as I said, there's been general agreement that these waters should be waters of the US and of course federally protected. But the question then becomes, what about all these other, right? So we, there's been general agreement that these larger water bodies should be protected, but what about all these other types of water bodies that we typically find in a watershed? So for example, what about a tributary stream that flows into the river, or a wetland in the river's watershed? And this is where there's been debate. And the relative degree of connectivity between those water body types or among them. So for example, how connected is this wetland up here to this protected water body has really been at the cornerstone of both science and policy in terms of water protection. So these other waters include perennial streams, which are those that flow year round. They include, and so we talked about, they include the ephemeral streams, again, those that flow only after precipitation events. They include floodplain wetlands, which are wetlands that we find along lakes and rivers. And then they also include sort of these non-floodplain wetlands, sometimes called geographically isolated wetlands, that are found upland in the watershed. And those could be prairie potholes or vernal pools. In Ohio, we have a lot of vernal pools, for example, historically, there were a lot of wetlands in open prairie systems. So the question then is, to what degree are they connected, and not just connected via the flow of water, the surface water, but you could think of groundwater flow. You could also think of biological connectivity or chemical connectivity. So ultimately, connectivity is the notion that waters are connected to one another in various ways. And that because of these connections, streams and wetlands and other water bodies can influence downstream waters. So streams, for example, move sediment and organisms and nutrients from upstream to downstream. And thus even the small headwater streams in the watershed affect, the downstream waters. So the image here that I'm showing you really focuses on those hydrological pathways, so the water pathways. But keep in mind, this is not the only type of connectivity. And so if we think about this, these types of connections in a broader context, I think this really helps get this, it helps relate this message. So when we think of hydrological connectivity, is one type of physical connection. Other connections are also critical to consider and include the chemical connections and the biological or ecological connections. And I gave you some sort of definitions and examples in the slide there. But this is a really key point, as keep in mind that the original intent of the Clean Water Act was to protect biological, chemical, and physical integrity of US waters, of our nation's waters. And so I would underscore the word "and" here, right? Because it's not an or, it's not we protect one or the other, it's all of them. And this becomes really important in a bit, and you'll see why. We have this three-dimensional perspective of water quality. It's not one or the other, it's really the Clean Water Act is saying we need to protect all of them concurrently. So not only can the type of connectivity vary, but connectivity can also vary over time, right? So it may change over time. For instance, in ephemeral streams, again, those that only come up, flow after storm events, may have flow for short periods of time, but can make up really important, quantitatively important portions of stream miles in some areas of the country. Think, for example, of the desert Southwest. That said, I'll show you a couple maps later where you'll see some of the percentage of ephemeral streams in Ohio, and you might be surprised. So the figure here you're seeing, which is also taken from that connectivity report, illustrates sort of the sequential transformation of materials as they move upstream to downstream through a river network. And so here we have an ephemeral stream, as you'll see, that's exporting organic matter, right? So you have organic matter in an ephemeral stream that works its way downstream. So things like leaves, right, that have fallen into the stream. And then we have an intermittent stream that exports ammonium, which is taken up downstream by algae, which in turn is then eaten by invertebrates and the invertebrate fuel fisheries. And so you get the idea, right, that these are really important for watershed processes and biota downstream. So as the EPA Science Advisory Board, I remember we talked about what that was, is that board of experts, when they reviewed this connectivity report, and they pointed out, and I was on this panel, and we pointed out that a broad view is really required to understand connectivity at a watershed scale, in which processes occurring across the watershed are taken into account, and in which the cumulative or aggregate effects, so keep in mind, it's not just the effect of one wetland or two wetlands or three wetlands or one ephemeral stream or two or three, we have to think about the cumulative effects are really important as well. So for instance, the collective impacts of multiple of these small, non-floodplain wetlands, like vernal pools, for example, on downstream waters could be really important to understand and consider. So of course, as we know, nutrients is a big issue here in Ohio, and we think about this a lot. I know a lot of you have been exposed to this, and in many ways, not just through your education, but also in the public media and in other ways. But one big issue is this nutrient enrichment of surface waters, and one of the best known examples of connectivity, or certainly the most highly publicized examples, is and thinking about it across large spatial scales, is the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, which is largely attributed to nitrogen and phosphorus coming from fertilizer runoff from Midwestern fields that enter streams and make their way down into the Mississippi River and then to the Gulf of Mexico, which are hundreds of, if not thousands of miles away. And so this leads to these harmful algal blooms and biological deserts. And this really is just a quintessential example of how these cumulative changes to streams can affect downstream water quality, right? So we are, of course, up here in Ohio, and what we're doing is affecting this dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So that's an example of connectivity at a very broad scale, but think about that at the watershed scale as well. So as we think about connectivity, it's really important. It's important to understand why it's critical for both science and policy. And it really has become, as I said, I think you used the word the flashpoint for science and policy in terms of defining the waters of the US. So the connectivity, the degree of connectivity has been used to argue for and against including certain waters. So we know it's critical to water quality and ecosystem function. We know all parts of water are connected, but not to the same degree. And when I was on the board, we came up with this sort of idea of a connectivity gradient that recognized that the frequency of connection, the predictability and the duration and the magnitude and the timing and the rate of these exchanges were all very important in quantifying and describing the degree and downstream effects of these conditions. And I want to highlight that this is very important. It's not just that water bodies are connected. The question really becomes, in terms of regulation and protection, is how does a change in an upstream or upslope water body affect downstream protected system? So how does a change in an ephemeral stream potentially affect a river that's always been protected? So that's really at the crux of what the science and the policy is about. So that's sort of the scientific context around connectivity and why it's important. And as I'll talk about later, I've given a lot of talks and presented to the US Congress and others about sort of the scientific underpinning of connectivity, so we can really understand how legislation either supports the science or doesn't support the science. And so let's flash forward. As I said, that panel that I was on, the Science Advisory Board, was in 2014 and 15. It was at the time of the Clean Water Rule, which is how the waters of the US were protected. It was the basis of the protection under the Obama era rule, which again was called the Clean Water Rule. And then just this past year, 2020, the Navigable Waters Protection Rule came into effect. And so the EPA and the US Army Corps of Engineers finalized this rule to revise the definition of the waters of the United States. This is the most recent one. And it revises both the 2015 Clean Water Rule, which is the Obama era rule, and previous definitions. And as I said, it went into effect everywhere but Colorado. And essentially, in a nutshell, and I'm going to go through this to help you explain a little bit more of the nuances, but essentially it removes, or it has removed at this point, all ephemeral streams. So all ephemeral streams across the United States have lost protection. Some intermittent streams, so not it does protect a chunk of them, but not all. And then all those non-floodplain wetlands, like the vernal pools and prairie potholes and the whole suite of other non-floodplain wetlands, which are collectively at a minimum, this if you put all those together across the U.S., that would probably be about the size of West Virginia, if not larger. And actually even some floodplain wetlands, they all lost protection as well. And so you can see this kind of non-floodplain wetland complex here in Alaska. These are really meaningful systems for a lot of reasons. And so just to kind of give you an idea, this was the 2015 Clean Water Rule, and it was effect in the light blue states. A lot of states actually did not go into effect. So just to give you a little bit of a context. And now, of course, we've moved to the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, which is in effect, as I said, across all the states except for Colorado. So let's talk a little bit about some of the differences so you can just understand the magnitude of the changes we're talking about. So the 2015 Clean Water Rule and the and the pre sort of 2015 jurisdictions on the one side, and then the Navigable Waters Protection Rule on the other side. And again, just so I repeated this a lot, but just to make sure everybody's on the same page here, keep in mind, we're talking about waters of the US, which waters are protected under the Clean Water Act. These are the particular rules, and the Navigable Waters Protection Rule is the one that's in effect now. But to give you an idea, what were some of the key differences in the Navigable Waters Protection Rule versus the 2015 and pre-2015 rules? And so there are a lot, and I'm not going to go through them. We just don't have time to go through each one of them, but I kind of putting this together, highlighted some of the bigger changes, and I'll just kind of talk through, I think, some of the real salient ones that are that will help make the points for you all. So firstly, I would say, in terms of just an overview, that the Navigable Water Protection Rule eliminates this idea of a significant nexus test, which was a Supreme Court Justice Kennedy in 2006. There was this case, and he said, look, these waters, in order to be protected, have to have a significant nexus, so a significant connection point between the water body in question and a traditional navigable water body. So for example, if a floodplain wetland, right, a wetland next to a river, can we show that has a significant connection with the main river? Then it's going to be protected. But this particular rule removed that. There are still, so I guess that's the big one. There are a few other pieces I was going to mention, but I think that's the big one. I would say that traditional navigable waters, the ones that have long been protected, interstate waters, coastal, near shore coastal areas, large lakes, large rivers, those remain protected. The other thing I would mention is just that most agricultural exemptions, so ditches, farm ponds, these sorts of things, remained excluded. And so, tributaries and ditches is an important one, as many of you have probably heard, or if not, this is where we get a lot of, pushback on increased water protection as the ag community gets concerned that their farming practices are going to be overregulated. But for the most part, as you can see here, tributaries and ditches, for example, were mostly excluded under the Clean Water Rule. And so that really wasn't an actual problem. It was more of a problem that was a little bit based on a misunderstanding, perhaps, of the rule. So some of the major changes relative to the tributaries, right? So streams flowing into the smaller streams, is that most notable that under the 2015 Clean Water Rule, almost all streams were protected. And as I said, under the Navigable Waters Protection Rule, ephemeral streams lose protection. As well as some intermittent streams, which is highly problematic, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Lakes, ponds, and impoundments. Lakes and ponds were sort of moved to a separate category, and non-navigable isolated lakes and ponds, lose jurisdiction. So just a few points there. And again, this is more for a reference point for you all, so you can take a look at later when you have the time. Wetlands is a big one. So one of the most significant changes is in the interpretation of the word adjacent. And so this idea of if a wetland or something is adjacent to protected water, a traditional navigable water, it would have been protected. And that has changed a little bit. It's made that idea of adjacency, it's become more limited. And it really is based on hydrological connectivity. There must be hydrological surface connectivity, for example, between a wetland and a traditional navigable water body, so like a lake or a large river, right, or a perennial stream, in order for that wetland to be protected. The other piece I would mention is that under the Clean Water Rule, there was understanding that certain types of water bodies, for example, all those upland non-floodplain wetlands, may be needed. It was understood that it may be necessary to evaluate them on a case-by-case basis. And one of the concerns with the arguments towards the navigable water protection rule was that that was too hard to enforce and too onerous. the navigable water protection rule attempted to eliminate the need for these case-specific tests, but it didn't really do that. It actually added that for a number of other situations, and I'll discuss that later. But I think if you were to get into the arguments for and against these rules, one you would hear is that the navigable water protection rule, if you were to go to the EPA website, it would say it eliminated these needs and it made it more streamlined. That's actually not the case at all, and I think there's a lot of evidence that would back that statement up. But I think one of the biggest and most concerning parts, at least from a scientific standpoint, so for me, who's on the scientific end, is that the navigable water protection rule is not supported by the best available science. And this is a message I've taken really across the country in multiple different ways, as well as in Ohio. And I'll give you some examples of how that plays out. So first of all, the rule is reliant on hydrological connectivity only. And if you recall, before I mentioned that there's those three dimensions, right? Biological, physical, and chemical. And so the navigable water protection rule only relies on hydrological connectivity as a mechanism of connectivity. And so that's a major problem because the Clean Water Act, by definition, is meant to protect all those features, and the rule is actually only focused on hydrological connectivity and throwing out biological and chemical connectivity as a valid pathway connecting systems. And so let me give you an example. Consider the navigable waters protection rule definition of tributaries, which the agencies base on the relative flow permanence, meaning that perennial systems are protected, some intermittent, maybe most, but it's hard to know. A lot of that is still up in the air, which ones will be protected, and no ephemeral streams. But we know that other types of flows, right, ephemeral in particular, can have significant consequences for downstream waters. I gave you an example earlier in the movement of organic matter. But that's only one type of physical connectivity. For example, if you were to go into an ephemeral stream here in Ohio and see a dry stream, well, if you walk down that stream bed, you're going to see banks and bed and high water marks when there's flows. All those indicate the presence of a channel, right? And those are indisputable indicators of connectivity, of sediment, and of water at certain times from upstream to downstream. The rule also fully ignores biological and chemical connectivity. I don't have time today to go into all those types, but just keep in mind that, for example, aquatic biota provide a lot of important functional roles, including the transport of seeds and propagules and nutrients. Aquatic organisms such as fish and aquatic insects move within and among various water body types, including ephemeral and intermittent streams, wetlands when there's connectivity. And through these movements, biota prevent inbreeding and escape stressors, right? And they locate mates, find food resources, recolonize habitats, but they're also critical to the function of these systems. So when we just remove that type of connectivity, we really remove an understanding of how upstream changes can lead to downstream losses of ecosystem function and water quality. Another real problem, a problematic issue, is that the rule misinterprets or ignores the natural gradients and the importance of considering the cumulative effects of connectivity. I talked about this before, right, where we had, we can say, well, maybe removing one vernal pool or a few vernal pools isn't going to make a huge difference in the overall integrity of our of our waters. But when we start to add it up, it is going to, right? And I always use an example like, well, if you break one finger, you can still type, right? But if you break all fingers on your hand, that makes it really hard. So you lose that functional connectivity. So you really have to think about that in context. And they haven't done that. It's not there. The other piece to recognize is that there's so much focus on connectivity, on hydrological connectivity as a basis for protection. We also have to think of that even low or infrequent connectivity can be important to downstream waters. In fact, the relative isolation of some water bodies, such as some wetlands, provide a critical function, and they trap pollutants and nutrients and prevent them from entering downstream waters. So it's much more complex. It's a complex science, and to overly distill it and force rules on it that don't back up the science is highly concerning. Another line of evidence is that, the current rule just does not appropriately recognize how watersheds function. As I just said, it's trying to overly simplify a pretty complex issue. It completely ignores groundwater connectivity. We know water has surface movement and subsurface movement, and those are an integrated resource, surface and subsurface waters, but that's completely ignored. And you can make the argument that it's overly reliant on using case law to delineate watersheds and landscapes, and really, so they use a lot of text in the months and years preceding this rule, and all the debate that went around it, and the public comments and the drafts and so forth. There's a lot of text around case law, and instead of actually a solid scientific understanding of how these watersheds actually function. I'm not saying that case law doesn't have a place here, don't get me wrong, but the key piece actually has to be around the science, and then using case law, I would argue, right, that's appropriately supporting that science. And as I said, it disregards groundwater connectivity, and this is a real big one. It's well established that the interactions between surface and groundwater make them a single resource. I mentioned that. And certainly over short and spatiotemporal scales, distinguishing between surface water and groundwater is inappropriate. Wetlands and streams are linked by integrated surface water and groundwater flow systems, which really control or at least modulate the local storage of water and the rate at which water flows to downstream waters. And in fact, the close connection between surface and groundwater has led, in the scientific world, we have terms, for example, hyperrheic terms that actually describe in rivers that, that zone that is sort of between surface and subsurface water, that zone of mixing. And so, this is ultimately, the fact that groundwater is excluded shows a significant lack of understanding where and how natural waters accumulate on the landscape. And so, again, a really major scientific gap here that's not being addressed. And then the last, I think, a really important part of forming a rule, and certainly in a durable rule, is actually using the available information correctly. And so there's large gaps, as I've mentioned in the last few examples, of just the science being completely excluded. But then there's also science that's being used it's being misinterpreted. And a real good example of this is how the agencies, and again, the agencies meaning EPA and the Corps of Engineers, because they're the ones who formed with the basis of coming up with the new rule, they really improperly used findings from our science advisory panel relating to this figure. And this figure was available to them, and they used it to support removing protection for ephemeral streams, or at least to some degree, and non-floodplain wetlands. However, it's really misinterpreted in both intent and character, and it's taken out of context. And so the conceptual figure you're seeing, as written by the panel, is meant to convey that connectivity between streams and wetlands and downstream waters, and thus the potential consequences to those downstream waters is not a binary property. So it's not connected versus unconnected, right, or not connected. But it's more appropriately represented by a gradient, and I mentioned that before. With some streams and wetlands comparably less connected to downstream waters than others, and recognizing that. So although the agencies in developing the rule cited low levels of connectivity as justification for removing protections, they failed to account for the fact that even low levels of connectivity can be important, as I mentioned, and two, the cumulative effects of aggregated streams and wetlands must be considered. I've also mentioned this, but this is an example how they're using data or information incorrectly. What we recommended as an SAB panel was case-by-case treatment of non-floodplain wetlands, because the science, at least at the time, and this was multiple years ago now, was not sufficiently developed around non-floodplain water body connectivity. But I would say that scientific advances since then suggest that no connectivity is unlikely. And so, and there's a lot of data around that. To highlight a few points, this figure really highlights that low levels of connectivity can be very important. It doesn't say that low levels of connectivity equal not being important. Cumulative effects must be recognized. And as I said, we recommended these case-by-case treatments. So this figure, I think, a lot of us in the SAB would say it was a move forward in trying to think about how we view the connectivity as a gradient versus as a binary property, and recognizing the cumulative nature of the aggregate effects are important, recognizing that even low levels of connectivity can be important. And this was just used as used and misinterpreted in a very egregious way. So that leads us to the a situation where we just have a very unclear and a rule that's not defensible. That is now the federal rule that exists in the U.S. And I think one of the biggest points here in this particular slide, I mean, I've talked about a few of the pieces here a little bit already, but that we as scientists have provided over many, many years, and this has come from many, many types, as I mentioned, even in 2014 and 15, and the science has moved ahead considerably since then. There were 1,200 independent peer-reviewed articles that were reviewed as part of that connectivity report, and that we as the SAB, the Science Advisory Board, then reviewed. So we have a scientific basis for the arguments that we're making. And I think I've hopefully shown you that today. But the agencies in developing this rule did not provide any comparable body of peer-reviewed science to support the navigable waters protection rule. And so if we go back to this map we had earlier, we can start to see, let's recap a little bit. So I'll take you back to this image, right? And we'll kind of remove where we lost protection. So we lost protection, right, for all these ephemeral streams. We lost protection for all the non-floodplain wetlands. And then we've lost partial protection for these intermittent streams, and actually even some of the floodplain wetlands have lost protection. This is another image, one that I have in one of my articles about sort of a policy article about this, how the science and the rule just don't match up. And as you see, everything here on the left is protected, but all these on the right are not protected, including groundwater. And so let's just talk a few minutes about ephemeral streams of Ohio. So I know a lot of people, I think, make the argument, and I've certainly seen this at the state level, that, well, Ohio, this doesn't really matter to Ohio much because we're a pretty wet climate and we don't really have a lot of ephemeral streams, or the ephemeral streams that do exist are just not big parts of watersheds, right? Well, I think we can show here that that's actually not the case. And so this is based on a variety of methods, but using one data set, the National Hydrography data set, we can see that almost 34,000 miles of perennial streams exist, 53,000 miles of intermittent streams, and only 9 miles of ephemeral streams. The problem with this is, and there's a huge problem that's been recognized, and I didn't bring this up earlier, but it's another issue, is that National the hydrography data set is developed by digitizing aerial images. And what happens is that many large percentages of our smaller headwater streams are actually not captured in those maps. And there's been research that show that just huge parts of watersheds are not being mapped. They're just not, those smaller streams are not being mapped. And of course, many of these smaller streams could be ephemeral. And so there was some work done by a colleague of mine and others at Trout Unlimited that developed a higher resolution mapping system. And when you use that, you identify an additional 45, almost 46,000 miles of ephemeral streams. So combined, we have 132,424 miles of ephemeral streams, which represents 34% of total stream mileage in Ohio. So that's pretty significant. And here's one example in sort of Southeast Ohio of Sandy Run watershed, where 18% streams in this catchment are ephemeral, but were not captured by the blue line streams that you would get from that previous data set I mentioned. And then here's another example of right here in Columbus, in more of an urban system, but still 61% of the streams in this catchment are ephemeral and were not captured by those blue line streams. So really, this is an issue even here at home. The other point I would mention, and we talk about climate change a lot and the importance of that, but climate has not been addressed at all in the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. And in fact, there's some real issues with this. We have seen some really cutting edge research showing that perennial streams can shift to intermittent and ephemeral. So for example, through a combination of climate change and and groundwater withdrawals. There has been research that has shown this. And so we may expect to see that certain types of streams will fall out of protection as they go from perennial to intermittent to ephemeral. Similarly with wetlands, some may become non-permanent in the future, losing protection. So in a nutshell, we have this rule that's inconsistent with science and certainly with the intent of the Clean Water Act. I talked about a lot of these issues already, the ecological issues, so I won't review that again. But I will also point out that headwater streams and wetlands are also culturally important for many segments of U.S. society for many reasons. For the majority, they're important for a lot of reasons, but also they have particularly high significance, for example, for many indigenous communities. And so impairment or loss of chemical, physical, and biological integrity of our nation's waters, and thus, certainly would lead to lower water quality is, we're certainly, pretty assured to see that under this rule, which is in effect now. So I want to kind of finish up by just talking about my experiences in policy and advocacy around this. I've mentioned those in a few cases. But a lot of my work, and this isn't the only area I've been involved with policy and advocacy, but this is certainly the primary one. As I mentioned, I've been involved in the EPA science advisory panels. I've written comment letters and letters to the Hill. I have given US congressional updates and presentations, given multiple seminars and podcasts, presentations like this and others. I've published on this, written op-eds at federal and local levels, and then also written sort of declarations for litigation. So I've had a broad suite of experiences in terms of thinking about how do we translate the science to policy, but also how do we effectively communicate the science to broader audiences? Because a lot of this, I think, is about reaching different audiences. So I'll talk about a few of these in the next just a few minutes before we finish up here, and give you just a few examples. So in terms of thinking about legislative briefs and state of the science, it's really about doing similarly what I just did with you folks, is to talk about, this is the science that underlies the discussion. And these are the ways that the rule, and with the Clean Water Rule, it was much more in alignment with the science. So, and the Now Waters Rule deviates from the science, but to really be able to show in a nutshell and in very concise ways, sometimes you have 10 minutes, sometimes you have 20 minutes, right, to get there and get that across. And you're talking to legislators, senators, and congressmen and women, and their aides. So it's really important to understand the audience and to balance that, strong show of expertise with the clear, poignant remarks that leave the legislators and others with an improved understanding of the issues. And also we provide the slides and these sorts of things. The other, I think, really key objective here is to articulate the scope of the policy. And in this case, the navigable waters protection rule, as I shared with you folks, a few pieces to look, this is problematic and it doesn't match the science in these particular ways. And this is the scope. It could affect, like I showed you with the Ohio maps, these percentages of streams, people can get an idea of the magnitude of the issue. We also met with individual legislators here in Ohio, as well as on the Hill in DC. I mean, I think these are a little different experience. They need to be more individualized, know your legislator, know what's important to them. What do their constituents care about and why, and be ready to sort of talk about that. For example, in Ohio, a lot of it's a big ag constituency, and they're concerned about losing, as I mentioned, or having their systems overly regulated. So being able to go in and say, look, the ag ditches are, for the most part, off the book. They're not there's exemptions for those. There's certainly exemptions for ponds. Puddles are not going to be regulated. So there's just a lot of misinformation out there. And then also, what are the follow-up plans? Do we have follow-up plans to follow up with the legislators afterwards? I think publications are really important, but not just publications. And in this, for example, that you're seeing on the left was in a scientific journal, but also thinking about other audiences. So we wrote an article for the Hill that really kind of challenged the disregard for science, and we certainly focused on WOTUS, the waters of the US, but we actually provided some other examples of where science really is critical in upholding environmental regulations. And then also locally, I wrote one in the spring. Many of you may have heard of a particular House bill that's moving now through the process into the Senate, and that would remove, following the federal guidelines, it would remove protection for all ephemeral streams in Ohio. And Dr. Cruz mentioned that earlier in terms of where we met, sort of potentially providing the scientific information and overview for the state attorney general. I think working with a diverse set of partners and audiences is something that I've done a lot around this rule and other pieces and other sort of advocacy, but that's really important to the consideration of alternative perspectives. I mentioned work with certainly that these have cultural importance for tribal and indigenous folks. And I work a lot with, for example, the Coeur d'Alene tribe in northern Idaho, and on this in other issues, but to think about, or have conversations about these, but to think about different perspectives that are important to understand. For example, when I describe connectivity to you in a very Western perspective of Western science, indigenous folks may have a very different perception of what connectivity might mean for them. And I think those voices have not been heard in this conversation enough. But part of reaching broader audiences is really spreading the word and thinking about how do we get the word out to various audiences. And so a variety of ways to do that, I think, are important. And just to kind of the last couple of slides, last couple of thoughts I would share with you is, that there are barriers in place. And I think as scientists, we do face barriers to this type of advocacy or certainly policy work. And I had a colleague of mine who, we talked about this and he had discussed this as well. And he brought up a few that I'll repeat here. These include that it's not part of the job description. So Mark Rains is my colleague, and he was one of the co-authors on that paper, and we've worked a lot in this space together. And we were talking about this, and he gave a presentation once around this issue too, and talked about, it's not part of our job description as scientists to do this sort of policy or outreach work. And it's not part of our reward or career building structure, which is important. And then ultimately, we have limited time, right? So most of us are already working well over the one FTE full-time, appointment with the teaching and research and outreach or extension or other activities we have. So where does this fold in, and how does it actually play into professional development? That's a huge barrier in terms of academics and others, scientists in this space, is just finding out how to do this in a way that's impactful, but also works within the context of their, in their own people's, our own careers. And I would also add that there's a communication barrier. Most scientists are not trained in this type of communication, which is, in written and oral form, but it's a very different type of communication than to a typical scientific audience and the types of ways we write and talk in terms of scientific audiences. So in that sense, I think we do a great service when we train our students to be able to have these various communication skills in policy and in public engagement in other ways. So how do we get past these barriers? And I don't have an easy answer for that question. I can say for me, it's sort of it's this idea of coming up with a strategy that integrates the different activities around, and in this case, I'm using WOTUS, but around sort of policy or advocacy work. And so for me, it's linking the various pieces that, I gave you that list of areas I was involved in, and I think linking those can be effective and rewarding and help build a portfolio that has meaning and impact, not only in terms of the policy and the advocacy, but also in terms of my own professional career, which is partly what we have to think about in a realistic way. And so I think you can think of, I've thought about a lot about scaffolding the type of work I do and broadening the audience and providing that service, but also linking it into the key sort of metrics and pieces that are important in my own career. And so I think there's many other ways to do this, of course, but ultimately we have to figure out if this is something we're passionate about and we really want to make a difference in, how can we actually do this in the context of our own lives? So I'll just leave you by thinking, and this was sort of the title, what role should scientists play? And there was this nice quote from the AAAS Science and Human Rights Coalition that said, scientists and engineers can and should also play a role in protecting people's access to clean and safe water. And this was just, what the speaker said during that, recent meeting. And I agree with that. It's certainly something I have practiced. I certainly, I guess, would, advocate for scientists being advocates. And I think if we think about this in other sectors of our lives, we certainly, if I were to ask you, would you want your primary physician to not advocate for your own health, right? I mean, I think everybody would I think we can agree. Most people would say, no, we want them to advocate for our health. Well, I think similarly, as who better is there to speak about scientific issues than the scientists who are most deeply involved in them and trained in them. That's not to say there's not a role for science communication folks and others, absolutely. But I think scientists need to be a part of that discussion and part of that process. And so I would encourage you each to think about, as you go through your careers, what role you can play. I absolutely do believe that scientists should be translating their work to policy, but stepping beyond that and actually being an advocate for the science. I have found in my own work that has been very important. And I think that ultimately, and I have heard from colleagues that are lawyers and professionals in other areas working in this space that say we need more scientists to come to the table and play these roles, because without them, we just don't have the same voice. I will go ahead and leave you with that. There's some additional resources, and I still think we have enough time for questions.
Thank you so much, Vijika. I really appreciate the presentation. I think that there's a lot of value for these up and coming scientists that we have in our environmental studies program, and then for our students in our public administration program from that lens of speaking to the policymakers. I do want to quickly hop over to the chat. I have some questions here. We have Olivia Barnes asking, how do you balance Indigenous and cultural concerns for water protection with the science needed to inform proper policy? Would you say legislators are more receptive to a scientific perspective or a cultural one? Great question, Olivia.
Yeah, that's a really insightful question. I think part of it is we need to blend and have to blend perspectives. In fact, I'm working with a couple American Indian Native colleagues on an analysis in a paper now where we're actually looking at So I should say before I answer that, the Biden administration is now revisiting this rule again and trying to come up with a durable rule. And so, as I mentioned, Indigenous voices have not had as much of a say as they need to, and particularly because a lot of these tribes have entered into a trust responsibility with the U.S. government, meaning that in addition for essentially being stripped of their homelands and being forced on reservations, there is a trust responsibility by the U.S. government to protect the natural resources and cultural resources of those lands, right? And so there's a responsibility by the U.S. government that you can argue that these are sovereign nations. So that voice really needs to be heard. And I think one of the issues, Olivia, there is to think about it's blending sort of our traditional Western views of science with Indigenous knowledge. And that is a view of science that wraps into the cultural perspective as well. So in my mind, and I think the more I mature in this understanding and working with folks, it's how do we blend those in a very impactful way that actually incorporates sort of those cultural contexts in the type of science, right? In the knowledge that we use. So not just using, so sort of a biocultural approaches to conservation and to water protection. So hopefully that helps. Since I think in terms of the legislators, that's a hard one. I think legislators oftentimes are, it's really about their constituents. I've had conversations where the legislators say, oh, no, I understand the science is so important. Then there's always the but most of our constituents are, in ag, or most of our constituents, we have a lot of, industry, and they're really concerned about this. So I think for legislature, I think we need to make sure that we are supporting our representatives that are respecting that respect science and as well as sort of cultural contexts, and putting that on the same level, if not higher, than purely monetary concerns. So yeah.
Thanks, Majika. I appreciate the perspective there, and I think that's a really great point that you need to influence the constituents too, not just legislators, because obviously the legislators, they care about those constituents' votes, and so if you can, it's interconnected there of who we need to influence to care about the cultural perspectives and the science perspectives here. I have another question from Elaine Gowitz in the chat. She's asking, what can you do when the science is clear and has been clearly communicated, but policymakers still make decisions not supported by science?
Yeah, you just got to keep at it. I think, ultimately, a lot of that, I think part of that is the reason I've engaged more in the op-eds and other sort of writing where you can engage the public. I think obviously reaching constituents is a way to do it. If you can get constituent bases to contact their legislators, that's important. But you're right. I mean, at some point there's only, we can keep working at it. We don't want to give up. But there is moments of frustration when, the science is there, but it's not being it's not being used properly. The other part is to be involved in the litigation. So on the backside, when the rule goes through, there's immediate litigation to try to counteract it, for example, and I've been involved in that end as well. So there are pathways, but as you can imagine, it's not always easy.
Thank you. I have Lorraine asking a question. I think it's a great one for the students in the room here, or in the virtual room here. How do you prepare your students to be prepared for, going into advocacy? Do you promote advocacy at professional meetings?
Yeah, so I do. I'm actually pretty actively involved. I'm on the board of directors for the Society of Freshwater Science. And these are things, I think it comes down to how we view science, right? I think we need a broader perspective of the contributions of individuals. I think there's multiple ways to contribute to the broader scientific portfolio that can come through multiple ways. It can come through advocacy, it can come through community outreach, it can come through publications, the traditional way, right? And so I think some of it is actually changing the culture so that that's more valued in people's professional and personal trajectories. In terms of, yeah, some of this is some work at a national level. We can start incorporating some of these issues, different types of sessions, for example, at our meetings, or off, out of opportunities for society members to engage outside the professional meeting and maybe around these types of issues. In terms of preparing students, that's a hard, I think multidisciplinary approaches are great, but beyond that, I think students need the firsthand practice. And so I know in my group and at the Wetlands at the Ohio State, we certainly, I try to give students opportunities to interact with stakeholders and interact with constituents to have them see the role I play in this, and maybe that there's a pathway for them there. And to encourage opportunities, policy fellowships and others. And so to encourage students who may be getting a degree in sort of what we would consider natural science, sort of a very focused degree in natural science, but to consider other opportunities to get exposure and to expand what you can do with that degree, and how you can integrate the policy and the advocacy within that is important. So providing opportunities, providing exposure is, I think, the way that it has to happen.
Thanks, Mazika. Yeah, it's great tip there to get exposure and get practice before you go out into the field. After you graduate. I know it's 1 o'clock. Do you have time for one more question for me, Mazika?
Sure.
Awesome, thank you. I have Dr. DeVelco in the chat here asking, for the EPA panel experience, what, if any, do you attribute to the EPA professionals not using science to the large number of staff departures that occurred during the Trump administration? Do you get anecdotal insights into the constraints that government scientists you were interfacing with had, given the different priorities and practices that contributed to disregarding the science?
So, I'll clarify one piece of that. So I was on the Science Advisory Board pre-Trump, and so that was the Obama rule. And then the other piece that I referenced was that the sitting Science Advisory Board, and it's a little more complex than that, but those that were reviewing it came out with a statement that was really strongly against the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. So just to clarify that, I do think, and I'm just looking at your question to make sure I'm answering it. Yeah, I probably can't speak to I don't know about the, I do know there was a lot of departures. Obviously, I think we can infer that there was a lot of discomfort around the gap between science and what was being directed by the Trump administration. Beyond that, I just don't have any, other information there. In terms of anecdotal insights into the constraints, yeah, that's a tricky, that's a hard one. And that's why you saw, again, that goes back to why a lot of folks left. A lot of these scientists are excellent scientists and colleagues at federal levels and in the EPA at the time, and that are really up against a rock and a hard place, right? Where it's, what do you do? You're giving specific directives, but that that's not following the science. And so I think there are constraints. I will say on the Science Advisory Board itself, when I was there, of course, those were, non-EPA scientists, because it was to give a different, that was the charge. But that's probably as much as I can say. I don't know if I really helped you too much. It's a very complex issue, but I certainly don't want to, I want to, leave that comment by saying there are outstanding colleagues and scientists in EPA. I think those are two separate things, right? There's the quality of the science and the outstanding individuals, and then there's the top-down directives that are coming from administration and certainly during the Trump years, that was saying, no, this is what we're going to do, and this is how it has to go forward. And in the end, that's why the board at that time said, we fully disagree with this rule for these particular reasons. And so, So yeah, so that's probably the best I can offer there. It's a complex question. I think you're thinking about this in a really, I think a very intuitive way. But this is where science and politics becomes very, very different. And I will say this is where I enjoy certain freedoms as a university professional that certainly government folks are not going to be able to advocate in the same way.
Thanks, Ms. I appreciate that. I know that was a complicating question.
Yeah, no problem.
I do want to thank you so much for presenting to the school today. I realize we're a little bit past 1 o'clock, so thank you for taking the extra time with us to answer some more questions. Really appreciate all of your time and talents and insights and telling these students to get out there and be better advocates for as scientists. I do hope you all have a great weekend.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a pleasure. If anybody has other questions I want to follow up, then I think you're welcome to do that. So yeah, I enjoyed being here. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. Yes, please do follow up. Use this connection, folks. I do want to remind you all we have our next and final session of the semester on December 3rd. It will be with the Director of Research and Analytics at the Ohio Colleges of Medicine Government Resource Center, Dr. Timothy Sarr. So I hope we can see you all at that. I will be sending some emails here shortly to sign up and register for that session as well. And thank you all again for joining us and hope you have a great weekend.
Bye.
Thank you, Majika.
Thanks, everyone.